I had barely sat down and gotten settled in for my morning hunt when, to my great surprise, a sow feral hog stepped out of the brush directly in front of me. She was just 15 yards away at the time and immediately saw me as I turned my head to look at her. She was standing broadside, and I hurriedly threw my rifle up to my shoulder, acquired a sight picture, squeezed the trigger, and fired. I heard the bullet slap home, and she squealed and immediately bolted off into the brush. That whole sequence of events took place over the course of maybe 5 seconds. After the shot, I gave her a couple of minutes, then I stood up and proceeded to track her. What I discovered was what remains one of the most impressive blood trails I have ever seen in my life. It looked like somebody ran through the woods spraying blood out of a hose. There was blood up on the bushes, there was blood on the ground, there was blood everywhere, and it was obvious to me that not only was this hog bleeding very heavily, but she was bleeding heavily out of both sides of her body. That remains one of the easiest blood tracking jobs I have ever done in my entire life, and I found her a short time later, perhaps 75 to 100 yards away from where she was when I shot her. Now, I discovered when I recovered her that my initial shot was not very good. Now, not only did I make a very rushed shot, but I also had just been aiming a little bit too far back. That sort of shot placement where I was aiming would have been appropriate for a white-tailed deer, but feral hogs' vitals are located a little bit farther forward in their body compared to a deer. So I was aiming a little too far back, and in my rush, I hit even farther back. So that made the fact that she did not go extremely far and also left a very easy-to-follow blood trail even more impressive to me. And not only was that my first experience shooting a feral hog, but that was also my first experience hunting with a cartridge in the 8mm or 32 caliber bore diameter that I will discuss in this episode. And I will tell you, I was darn impressed with how that cartridge performed on that hunt. Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 399 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. And yes, this is a rare Wednesday release. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving in the United States, and I wanted to get this episode out ahead of the holiday and let you listen to it while you might be traveling. And of course, if you're listening to this in Europe, well, you just get it a day earlier than usual. Next week's episode will release on Thursday. Now, in this episode, I talk about all of the different 8mm and 32 caliber SAAMI standardized cartridges. I will also talk about a couple of noteworthy CIP 8mm rounds as well. As always, I talk about their history, design characteristics, performance specs, all of that stuff, and I will also share some personal anecdotes involving these rounds and some observations involving some of them by noteworthy gun writers. And yes, I will reveal the details of that hog hunting story I just told you about. Now, 8mm is an area where European cartridges really dominate. But that said, the 32 caliber bore diameter, which is very similar in size, existed in parallel in the United States. It has mostly died off here over the course of the past century, though some cartridges in this bore diameter are still in use. And some European 8mm cartridges have made the trek across the Atlantic and gotten established here, and even have spurred development of some uniquely American 8mm cartridges as well. And of course, the 8mm bore diameter is still doing great in Europe. Now, while this is a still relatively common bore diameter in use in Europe, there have been many 8mm cartridges that have kind of come and gone over the years. Most of them were not very successful, and they died a quiet death. So with that in mind, I'm not going to cover every single 8mm cartridge that has ever existed. I'm going to focus on the most popular and the most consequential cartridges in this episode. And I will throw in a few others that were especially interesting to me and or that had a lot of potential or that I just had personal experience hunting with. As always, I will share some interesting stories and anecdotes involving some of these cartridges. For instance, I will talk about how the Versailles Treaty affected firearm and cartridge development in Germany between the world wars. I'll talk about how one of these cartridges and the rifle it was designed for may have inspired the AK-47 and the 7.62 by 39mm cartridge. I'll also, of course, talk about how these rounds perform on game like elk, deer, hogs, and even a polar bear that a famous American hunter poached in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Before we get started, make sure you are on my email list. And if you like the podcast, you will love the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. Sign up at the link in the show notes or at biggamehuntingpodcast.com/ebook. I also invite you to join me in the community I am building on Patreon for my supporters there. I have some nice bonus perks and things like that I give to my Patreon supporters, like discount codes, special content I create only for them. I also give them the opportunity from time to time to make episode requests and things like that. Go to patreon.com/biggamehunter, sign up there, and get access to all of that stuff. Links to my Patreon page and to where you can sign up for my email list are both in the episode description as well. All right, let's get started talking about the 8mm/32 caliber bore diameter. Development of this general bore diameter really took place over the course of two separate development tracks. One in Europe for 8mm cartridges and a separate one in the USA for 32 caliber cartridges. We'll start in Europe and then work our way forwards in time there and then make the switch to the United States. Now, 8mm is commonly known as a popular bore diameter in Germany, but the story of 8mm cartridges really begins with a French cartridge known as the 8mm Label or the 8x50mm R. Now, just as a little bit of context on the development of this cartridge, the French got their tails kicked by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871. Now, there is nothing like a humiliating defeat like that to get your priorities straight. So the French really wanted to avenge that loss to what would become Germany after the war. They instituted a big rearmament and modernization program after the war that, among other things, resulted in a new infantry service rifle called the Model 1886 Label, chambered in the new 8x50mm R bottlenecked cartridge. This was the first military rifle to use ammunition loaded with smokeless powder. It replaced the 11x59mm rimmed Gras round. That was a black powder cartridge firing a big lead bullet. It looked very similar to a Martini Henry cartridge, but that makes sense. They were both in use around the same time. So the 8mm Label was part of a transition away from black powder to smokeless powder, and along with that, from larger caliber lead bullets to smaller caliber jacketed bullets. The 8mm Label fired a 232 grain jacketed flat nose, flat base bullet called a Ballet M. It was replaced by a solid bronze Spitzer or pointed boat tail 198 grain bullet called a Ballet D. Muzzle velocity 2380 feet per second for that loading. It fired a .327 caliber bullet. The French used that rifle and that cartridge through World War I. They eventually replaced it with the 7.5 by 54mm Moss round I discussed 1 year ago in episode 347. This cartridge is CIP standardized as the 8x51mm R Label. Now, in addition to the original 1886 model rifle, Remington, believe it or not, also produced rifles in this chambering for the French government. Those were primarily Remington rolling block rifles, and PPU actually still makes ammo for it too, 200 grain full metal jacket bullet at 2,300 feet per second. Well, the Germans just had to respond to this new French rifle and cartridge. They developed their own similar cartridge that is now known as the 8x57mm J or I round. This is a complicated story. There's an entire family of cartridges that have evolved over the years out of this, and I'm going to do my best to explain it to you. This original round was known as the Patron 88. That is German for cartridge. This was a early smokeless design developed in response to the French 8mm Label. It was designed by the German Infantry Board at Spandau for the German military model 1888 rifle. This original rifle was not designed by Mauser. It was a modified Mannlicher design. So this cartridge was also known as the 8x57mm I for infantry. That is the official designation of it with CIP. Now, as the story goes, the letter I was mistaken for a letter J by interpreters looking at German documents. And so now the cartridge is sometimes known as the 8x57mm J. And sometimes even German people call it by that name with the J instead of the I. But for all intents and purposes, you can use the J and the I interchangeably. Now, CIP max pressure for this cartridge is about 55,000 psi. The original loading for it was a 226 grain round nose bullet at about 2,100 feet per second. And it fired a .318 caliber bullet. So that cartridge operates on a level similar to the old 3040 Krag, but the 8x57J or I is a little bit more powerful. But things developed rapidly over the next few years. Mauser released a series of different rifle designs in the 1890s that culminated in the legendary Model 1898 Mauser at the end of the century, and then the German military started using that new rifle. And among other improvements, the Model 1898 Mauser had a much stronger action that could safely utilize a more powerful cartridge. With this in mind, the Germans modified the 8x57mm I to take advantage of the strength of their new rifle. Namely, they loaded it quite a bit hotter, they changed the bullet diameter to .323 caliber, and they used a lighter, pointed or Spitzer bullet in the early 1900s. They called this new cartridge the 8x57mm JS, or the 8x57mm IS. It is also known as the 7.92 by 57mm cartridge. Rifles chambered in this cartridge have a .323-inch groove diameter to be compatible with the .323-inch bullets it uses, and it uses a .312-inch or 7.92mm land diameter. We will see this S designation several more times over the course of this episode, and that designates this cartridge is designed to use a .323 caliber bullet, and it is also usually used to designate the more powerful member of a family of cartridges. This round, the 7.92 by 57 or the 8 by 57 IS or JS, this is the cartridge people are talking about when they refer to the 8mm Mauser today. Yes, it's confusing. Do your best to stay with me here. Now, the original military load for this cartridge was a 154 grain pointed or Spitzer bullet fired at 2,880 feet per second from the 29-inch long barrel of the original 1898 Mauser rifle. That was the rifle the German army used in World War I. It was later replaced by the Karabiner 98K the Germans used in World War II. Now, the funny thing about that rifle, it was a shorter barreled rifle, but it still had a darn near 24-inch long barrel. Now, this cartridge is referred to as the German 30-06 sometimes, and it filled a similar role. It was used with the military, also saw a lot of civilian use for hunting and target shooting. It was actually a little bit more powerful than the 30-06 too, despite having a slightly shorter case. Now, there's a couple different 30-06 military loads, but the common ball load used in World War I and World War II fired about 150 grain Spitzer bullet at around 2,700, 2,750 feet per second. So that 8x57 IS military load had about 17% more muzzle energy. Now, that did come with a longer 29-inch long barrel, but that even with that in mind, that's still a not insignificant improvement. Now, it is important to note that the 8x57 IS is not interchangeable with the old 8x57 I or J cartridge. It operates at a higher pressure and it uses a larger diameter bullet. So for this reason, many older rifles chambered for the original 8x57mm J or I cartridge were rebarreled and rechambered for use with the 8x57mm J or IS cartridge. Now, this round is also SAAMI standardized. It's CIP standardized. It's also SAAMI standardized. And it's known to SAAMI as the 8mm Mauser or the 8x57 or the 8mm, in parentheses, 8x57. This is the .323 caliber version of the 8mm Mauser. Now, as is often the case with older European rounds, SAAMI throttled it quite a bit. They established 35,000 psi as the max average pressure for the 8mm Mauser. CIP specs for this round are 56,500 psi, so quite a bit hotter. This is all reflected with loaded ammo choices from both American and European companies. So, for instance, Federal makes a load with 170 grain power shock at 2250 feet per second. Winchester makes one with a 170 grain power point at 2360 feet per second. Now, according to my book, Cartridges of the World, those factory loads are downloaded to a much lower pressure in order to be safe to be fired in an old 8x57mm J rifle with the smaller .318 caliber bore diameter. It also says that the old 8x57mm J ammo can be safely fired in a newer 8x57mm JS rifle, but accuracy will be poor because there's such a mismatch with the bore diameter. My personal advice would be to not do this. Just use the right ammo and the right rifle. Fortunately, 8x57mm J ammo and rifles are very, very rare these days, and almost any ammo and any rifle you're going to run across now that has an 8x57mm stamp on it is going to be the newer S or .323 caliber loading. So while Federal and Winchester load this stuff pretty light, Buffalo Bore and most European companies load it much closer to its full potential. For instance, Buffalo Bore has a load 150 grain soft point at 2,900 feet per second, 195 grain soft point at 2,500, 200 grain Barnes TSX at 2,500 feet per second. Norma has a load 196 grain Oryx bullet at 26 feet per second. S&B has a load with a 220 grain bullet at 2,400 feet per second. And a 196 grain bullet at 2591 feet per second. RWS makes ammo for the 8mm Mauser too. Among many other loads, they have a 196 grain ID Classic at 2,540 feet per second. So here is a blurb from Roland Zeitler from the Nosler 9th edition reloading manual about this cartridge. I've owned an original Mauser 98 built in the late 1930s. Mainly, I shot matches with it using open sights. From the beginning, the 8mm Mauser was also a loved hunting cartridge. It is in Middle Europe, still very popular, especially for medium and large game like wild boar, red deer, or moose. It is also usable for the small roe deer without too much damage. I also own a nice bolt-action repeater with a new case-hardened Mauser 98 action. With Nosler bullets, it is with my hand loads a very accurate gun. The 8mm Mauser does not waste powder. The ratio from energy to the powder weight is excellent. With a 200 grain Nosler AccuBond or partition, the 8x57 is a suitable cartridge for all the game in the Northern Hemisphere. I've taken many wild boar, some heavy red stag, small roe deer, and a European brown bear. It is also a popular cartridge for most of the African plains game species like kudu, oryx, hartebeest, and zebra. Now here is a blurb from African Rifles and Cartridges as John Taylor waxes poetic about the 8mm Mauser. Right up to the present day, it has always been a popular light rifle for general use in conjunction with a more powerful weapon. Barnes was a great believer in it. Ryan used it extensively. Major Maiden has used it for some 30 years in preference to anything else. My old friend Musa Issa is never without one in all of his 40 years of hunting. I never possessed one myself, but used Musa's quite considerably when he was trying something of mine. I found it a most excellent little weapon and a good killer, but cannot find anything noteworthy to say about it, although I killed most varieties of game with it, including 2 or 3 elephant. It is an infinitely more satisfactory cartridge than the British .303. End of quote. So like I said, very useful, well-balanced cartridge. All in all, excellent choice for all-around use on game. Like I said, sort of like the German 30-06, anything that you would reasonably hunt with a 30-06, you could hunt with an 8x57. Now, interestingly, case dimensions are very similar to the 30-06 too. They both have the same .473-inch rim diameter. The 8mm Mauser has a 3.25-inch long overall length, So it's a little bit shorter overall than the 30-06, but very close. It also has a slightly shorter 57 millimeter long case instead of the 63 millimeter long case the 30-06 has. Now, the 1903 Springfield is darn similar to the Mauser 98, and some would even say the Springfield rifle is a copy of the Mauser. With that in mind, lots of German Mausers made it back to the USA after the World Wars. A lack of bullets and ammo made them common candidates for wildcats, though. My grandfather's 6.5-06 Ackley Improve started out as an 8mm Mauser. So did my dad's 35 Whelen. You could also rebarrel a Mauser, an 8mm Mauser, to 30-06 or 270 as well, for instance. Now, the 8mm 06 is another example. Now, while the chamberings I just mentioned required a new barrel, a cheaper and faster alternative was to simply ream the chamber out to 8mm 06. You could use the same barrel and load an 8mm bullet in a 30-06 case. That did require hand loading. It also required 8mm bullets, but it was a less complicated procedure to convert the rifle itself over like that without having to put a new barrel on it and all of that stuff. 8mm 06 was most popular in the USA in the 1950s and 60s, but some are still hanging around out there. As far as I know, there was never any factory loads for that cartridge, though. But for instance, Hornady still lists 8mm 06 in their reloading handbook. Now, while many 8mm Mausers were converted over to other cartridges in the United States, there's still lots and lots of 8x57mm Mausers floating around out there in the USA and elsewhere in the world. And in addition to those old surplus Mausers, there are plenty of modern production rifles in this chambering too. Blosser makes them, Mauser makes them in their modern production rifles. I'm sure Sacco and Tikka do as well, at least from time to time if they don't do it all the time. So this is a very old cartridge, but like the 30-06, still very popular, very effective all these years after it first came on the scene. In addition to the 8x57mm I and the IS version of the cartridge, there are also two other members of the family. We have the 8x57 IR and the 8x57 IRS. Those are rimmed versions of the 8x57 I and IS. These rimmed versions of those rounds are designed for use in single-shot and combination guns. They are slightly lower pressured and lower powered cartridges. And just like the rimless versions of the cartridge I just mentioned, these two cartridges use the .318 caliber and .323 caliber bullets, respectively. And they are used for essentially the same use cases as their more powerful cousins. They're just not quite as fast and powerful, and they're used in different types of rifles. So keep these general formulas in mind. I and J are interchangeable. An I or a J by itself designates a .318 caliber bullet. An I or a J with an S designates a .323 caliber bullet. And R designates a rimmed cartridge with a little bit lower pressure threshold. Now, while the original 8x57J cartridge is almost completely gone from the world, there are some more 8x57JR rifles out there. S&B makes factory ammo for them. Their load is a 196 grain bullet at 2329 feet per second. The 8mm JRS loading is a little bit more common. A couple different options out there for it. For instance, Norma makes a load with 196 grain Oryx. It's loaded at 2395 feet per second with the JRS cartridge. That's 131 feet per second slower than their load for just the JS. So there you go. That is the original 8mm Mauser family.
This podcast is sponsored by Goldbelly, shipping America's most iconic foods nationwide. Make this Thanksgiving one to remember with the original turducken, the viral pie cakin with decadent layers of cake and pie, and more. Plus, Black Friday is the perfect time to pre-order unique gifts they'll rave about for years. Use promo code GIFT for 20% off your first order on goldbelly.com. Goldbelly, America's best foods delivered.
Now, like I mentioned earlier, many of these important 8mm cartridges are of German origin, and sometimes there are important geopolitical events that have an outsized effect on the hunting/shooting/firearms industry. Well, the Treaty of Versailles is one such event. The peace settlement after World War I placed very strict restrictions on the number of military rifles Germany could have. Inspectors had broad rights to seize and destroy any excess war material or anything considered being easily convertible into war material. Firearms manufacturers in Germany went to great lengths to modify their products just to avoid any possible hint of suspicion that the rifles they were making for sportsmen in Germany could be considered in violation of the treaty and subject to seizure and destruction. So they made a lot of modifications to their stuff, right? They would turn down the bolt handle, they would put different sights on them, things like that. While enforcement of those treaty restrictions did become less stringent as time went on, the Weimar Republic also made a law in the 1920s, I think, that forbid people from possessing so-called weapons of war, and that prevented civilians from owning firearms in current or former military calibers if they were capable of chambering military ball ammunition without modification. That also spurred a lot of modification of Mauser rifles and development of new cartridges to get around those restrictions. One such cartridge was the 8x60mm S cartridge. That is a very similar performing cartridge to the 8x57mm S. They also made rimmed and J versions of this cartridge. Same idea as the J and or R versions of the 8mm Mauser. J or I version is .318-inch bore diameter, R is rimmed. And just like the name says, the 8x60mm cartridge is very similar to the 8x57, just has a slightly longer case, and it's just enough different that the ammunition between those two cartridges is not interchangeable, and thus it is in compliance with those regulations German firearms manufacturers and hunters and whatnot had to abide by. I'm not sure anyone makes factory ammo for it anymore, but Cartridges of the World lists 196 grain soft point at 2580 feet per second from RWS. That is similar to, but slightly faster than their current load I mentioned earlier with 196 grain bullet at 2540 feet per second for the 8x57mm IS. Wilhelm Brennecke explicitly also marketed a few of his inventions as non-military sporting cartridges that would function in a Mauser 98. One was the 7x64 Brennecke I discussed in my 7mm episode from last year. The 7x64 is essentially an 8x64mm S cartridge necked down to 7mm. Both of those rounds came around before these restrictions, but Brennecke saw the potential for commercial success and he adjusted his marketing appropriately. The 8x64mm S came along in 1912. That was a unique design with no parent case. It uses a slightly fatter case and a case that's a little bit longer than the 8x57mm, and it's 64mm long instead of a 57mm long case. So it has a larger powder capacity. It's a little bit more powerful, a little bit higher pressure. For instance, it could fire a 196 grain bullet at 2,673 feet per second. So around 150 feet per second faster than the 8x57. Later, a man named August Schuler built a cartridge he called the 8x68mm S. That is essentially an 8mm Magnum, very long, fat, beltless case. It was necessary to make modifications to the Model 98 Mauser in order to get that giant cartridge to fit in it, but it would work. It is a very powerful cartridge. It came along in 1938, and so there was a little bit less of a need to get around gun restrictions that existed at the time, but the fact that they had existed at one point and maybe still did, but just weren't enforced as stringently, probably played a part in the development of this cartridge, and it was in compliance with them. Now, unlike the 8x60 and 8x64, the 8x68mm did provide a substantial boost in performance over the old 8x57mm cartridge. So it has a 68mm long case, 87 millimeters long overall, 3.43 inches. So it's actually a little bit longer than a 30-06. It has a 13 millimeter diameter case head. That's 0.512 inches. So that is similar in diameter to a 300 Winchester Magnum. But unlike the 300 Win Mag, the 8x68 is a beltless case. It's also a higher pressure cartridge too, 63,800 PSI with CIP. So the relationship between the 8x57 and the 8x68 is essentially like that of the 30-06 to the 300 Win Mag. The 8x68S will fire a 200 grain bullet at over 2,900 feet per second, and so it's actually even a little bit more powerful than the 300 Win Mag. Norma currently lists a load with a 180 grain tip strike at 2,986 feet per second. RWS has a load with a 200 grain bullet at 2,936 feet per second. So a little bit more powerful than a 300 Win Mag, also uses a slightly larger diameter bullet. This is a hammer of a cartridge. It is much more common in Europe than is in the United States. I've actually never seen or shot one myself. Johann Seifert, one of my PHs, though, has guided a couple of European hunters on plains game hunts in Africa using this cartridge. He said to date, the most impressive kill he has ever seen on an eland was with a European guy with an 8x68. He said he made a great shot right in the shoulder of it, and he said it absolutely upended that eland. And a big eland like that can be as big or bigger than a Cape buffalo. Now, since this cartridge came along in 1938, that was right before World War II really started. So the war and the destruction of a lot of German industry during the war and in the aftermath of it really disrupted production of the cartridge, but it did gradually pick up again once, things got back together in Germany after the war. Now, the 8x60 millimeter and the 8x64 millimeter cartridges have fallen away quite a bit since World War II. They still exist, but not nearly as popular now as used to be the case because there's no longer a need to get around those restrictions that I was talking about. In terms of popularity, the 8x57 millimeter Mauser is still the king. The 8x68 millimeter cartridge is not as popular, but it is somewhat commonly used in Europe. This is a very niche round in the USA. It exists here, but it is not very popular, though. Joe Thielen from Hornady talked about in their podcast that he was using the 8x68 millimeter cartridge as a parent case for a project that would eventually become the 300 precision rifle cartridge in the USA. But he eventually modified the design to use a different cartridge case for this project because 8x68 millimeter cases were just so darn tough for him to get. But you can get rifles and ammunition for the 8x68 from a lot of the usual suspects in Europe, RWS, Norma, Mauser, Blosser, etc. Now let's circle back to the 7.92 by 57 millimeter cartridge, or the 8x57 millimeter Mauser, and talk about one of its offspring from World War II, the 7.92 by 33, or the 792 Kurtz. The 8 millimeter Mauser was a fantastic cartridge that was capable of excellent long-range performance. However, the German military realized most troops weren't engaging the enemy past about 300 yards in combat. Now, perhaps a sniper or a machine gun team needed the ability to reach out to longer ranges, but that's not something the average soldier needed. Thus, the cartridge was more powerful than what was necessary. Ammunition was also heavier. Recoil was also stout, and the typical German soldier was carrying a bolt-action rifle, so they didn't have a very large magazine capacity or a very high rate of fire. And the Carabiner 98K still had a 24-inch long barrel, so it wasn't the most handy rifle to use in tight spaces, like fighting inside of a building, for instance. For this reason, the German army made extensive use of machine pistols like the MP40 during the war. Those were much more compact weapons that worked fantastic at close range, once again, like urban combat, and they were capable of automatic fire, and they could be quickly reloaded by way of a large-capacity stick magazine. However, they used the 9mm Luger handgun round, and that had a limited effective range. It also wasn't very powerful. It was tough to hit a target past about 50 meters with one, and like I said, it just didn't have a lot of effect on the target. Multiple hits were often required to bring down or kill or stop an enemy soldier, and that was especially true at longer ranges. Thus, the German army started searching for a solution that would bridge that gap and give their troops rapid-fire capability with the ability to quickly reload like a machine pistol, but also gave them a more powerful weapon with a longer effective range that did not have the recoil of the full-sized Mauser cartridge. So they were looking for a so-called intermediate cartridge, more powerful than a handgun round, but less powerful than a full-sized 8mm Mauser. So they came up with the idea to simply shorten the 7.92 by 57mm cartridge and load it with a lighter bullet at a slower velocity. Thus, the 7.92 by 33 was born. Typical load, around 125-grain bullet at around 2250 feet per second. It was also known as the 7.92 Kurz, or 7.92 short. It used the same .323 caliber bullets the full-sized 8mm Mauser used, and this round was developed in conjunction with what is now known as the STG-44 rifle. That was an abbreviation for Sturmgewehr 44, that literally translates to Assault Rifle 44. This rifle had select fire capabilities. You could shoot both semi-auto and fully automatic with it. That provided a massive upgrade in firepower compared to the Carabiner 98K, as well as other weapons in use at the time, like an infield rifle or even an M1 Garand. The rifle came along late in the war, and the Germans just didn't make that many of them. This cartridge and rifle have made a lot of appearances in video games about World War II since then, and even perhaps more importantly than that, this rifle and cartridge look very similar to an AK-47 and its 7.62 by 39mm cartridge. It's very easy for me to believe that the Soviets captured some of these rifles and ammunition, and that influenced their thinking along those lines. Now, believe it or not, PPU actually still makes ammo for the 7.92 by 33mm cartridge, and this cartridge still sees limited military use in the world. There's a well-publicized clip of some Syrian rebels capturing a container with several thousand STG-44s in 2012. Now, some Mauser 98s were rechambered for this cartridge. I've also heard there are some civilian semi-auto reproductions of the STG-44 in production. Okay, now let's switch gears and head to the other side of the Atlantic and talk about 32 caliber cartridges. Now, this is a similar but not exactly the same bore diameter as the Europeans used for their 8mm. Now, there were several different black powder, rifle, and pistol 32 caliber cartridges I'm not going to cover in this episode. We're going to start with the 32 Winchester self-loading, though, and you'll see why I'm doing this here in a minute. I'm just going to read to you what Phil Sharp said about this cartridge in his book, The Rifle in America. I quote, "The Winchester self-loading cartridge is one of those useless numbers which are rapidly becoming obsolete. It was designed and used only in the Winchester self-loading or automatic rifle. It is neither powerful nor accurate, using a 165-grain full metal jacket or soft point at a muzzle velocity of only 1,390 feet per second. It is not suitable for anything except the smallest of game. This should never be used on deer. Winchester has discontinued the rifle to handle it, although the ammunition is still made by all commercial companies." End of quote. The only reason I even mention that cartridge is because it was the parent to what would become the .30 carbine cartridge used in the M1 carbine family of rifles. Now, Winchester made another 32 caliber cartridge known as the 32 Winchester Special. Not to be confused with the 32 Winchester self-loading I just mentioned, or the older black powder 3220 or 3240 cartridges. No, this is a completely unique cartridge that, even though the name is similar to those other ones, it has nothing at all to do with them. Introduced in the 1890s, the 32 Winchester Special is a larger bore cousin to the 30-30 Winchester. Basically, you neck down a 38-55 to 32 caliber, load it with smokeless powder, and there you go. Winchester also even offered it in the model 1894 lever action, like the 30-30. Standard load, 170 grain flat point at 2250 feet per second. Not too dissimilar from the 30-30 Winchester in terms of ballistics, though it does so with a larger diameter bullet. It is important to note that these American cartridges use .321 caliber, not .323 caliber bullets. So your bullet choices are somewhat limited for them, though they are out there. Hornady makes some, Remington, Winchester, so you can certainly get them. Now, as you can imagine, the 32 Winchester Special is not a super popular cartridge. It doesn't have very different performance characteristics from the 30-30. All you get is a little bit larger diameter bullet. It's even the same bullet weight at almost exactly the same velocity. This cartridge is still out there. You can still get factory ammo for it. Winchester, Remington, Federal all make factory loads. Hornady also makes a spicier load in their Lever Evolution line of ammo, 165 grain FTX at 2410 feet per second. Winchester also still offers this cartridge in their Model 94 lever action rifle, so you can get new production rifles in it as well. So this is a solid woods cartridge. Use it for the same sort of stuff you would use a 30-30 for, but like I said, literally just shoots a larger diameter bullet. That's about the only difference. Now let's talk about the 32 Remington. This is an obsolete cartridge. It's not SAAMI spec. I only mention it because its performance is so similar to the 32 Winchester Special, and I have also shot and hunted quite a bit with this cartridge. Now, this cartridge was released early 1900s. 1906 is thrown out there sometimes. Remington introduced it for their auto-loading Model 8 rifle. It was also available in the Model 14 slide action and the Remington Model 30 bolt action. Other companies did make it too, but it was primarily available in Remington rifles. Now, Remington made a whole series of cartridges for the new Model 8 and eventually the 81 rifles. You have the 25, 30, 32, and 35 Remington. Those cartridges had very similar performance to the 25-35, 30-30, and 32 Winchester cartridges. The 35 Remington is still around today, but the 25, 30, and 32 are all basically completely obsolete. You can hand load for them, though. Now, like I mentioned, almost identical performance for the 32 Remington to the 32 Winchester Special. Really, the only difference is the 32 Remington is a rimless cartridge, and it was designed for use in the Remington autoloader. And the Remington autoloaders were much more commercially successful than the Winchester autoloading series of rifles and cartridges. At one time, my dad had Model 8 rifles in all 4 chamberings. And believe it or not, for a long time when I was a teenager, a Remington Model 8 and 32 Remington was my go-to hunting cartridge. I've done an entire YouTube video on this cartridge in detail. I'll put a link in the episode description so you can check it out and learn a little bit more about it. But I'll just share a couple of quick stories with you in this episode, then we'll move on to the next one. Now, that story I told at the very beginning of this episode with the hog and the amazing blood trail, that was with a 32 Remington shooting a 186 grain RWS H-mantle bullet. I have no idea where my dad managed to find these bullets, but apparently they were the correct bore diameter, .321 caliber, instead of the traditional 8mm bore diameter of .323 caliber. But in any case, he got these bullets, loaded them in the rifle. They shot very accurate. Terminal performance was also devastating. The RWS H-mantle is a very old design. I think they have replaced it with a newer design, but the long story short with it, this was a dual core design. You had a very soft front lead core with it and a very tough rear lead core. And it didn't have a full partition between those lead cores, like, say, a Nosler partition does, but it had an H-shaped crimp on it. If you just took a cross-section of the bullet, it would look like an H with a little bit of the jacket kind of poking in at either side of it. But in any case, the idea of this bullet was it would hit an animal, that front core would rapidly fragment, cause a lot of damage, and then that rear core would stay together and punch all the way through the animal, usually exit. And the jacket was designed in such a way that it had a shoulder on the outside of the bullet that would cut a neat cookie cutter hole going in and out of the animal that would bleed freely. So you kind of get the best of all worlds with this, where you have a nice neat entrance wound, massive internal damage, great penetration, usually an exit wound with a cookie cutter clean exit wound that also bleeds well. So you're not blowing a fist-sized exit wound on the offside, but you have 2 wounds that they're not like kind of punched open like you see sometimes with bullets, where you'll have a very small entrance or exit wound, both approximately caliber size, but just cut very neatly, like I said, that bleed well. So hopefully the animal dies very quickly, doesn't run far, but if it does run more than a short distance, you have an easy to follow blood trail. Well, that is what I observed with that hog. Now, I shot several animals using that bullet out of that exact rifle over the years, and that was by far the most impressive blood trail I ever got out of any of them. But even the other ones, when they did have a trail for me to follow that I needed to follow, they didn't just, fall down real quickly. It wasn't just as ridiculous as that one with the hog, but it was still very easy to follow. I firmly believe that that bullet really saved my bacon on that hog I told you about at the beginning of the episode, because I just shot her too far back. But it made such an impressive wound and left such a good blood trail, I was still able to find her. Now, a couple of years later, I used that exact same rifle, exact same load, to take what remains the biggest whitetail deer I have ever killed. I was hunting out here in East Texas, took a shot on this deer that was following some does in late November, shot him behind the shoulder. He took off running, went about 50 yards in the woods and fell down, and very easy to follow blood trail, went straight up to him, and the wounds on that animal were also impressive. It wasn't a ridiculous blood trail like with the hog, but darned impressive, and it worked exactly the way it was advertised to. Now, I originally switched over to that bullet because the performance I was getting from the traditional 170 grain soft points was less impressive than I wanted, especially on a lot of the hogs I was shooting out here in East Texas. I talk about a story in that YouTube video that, like I said, just go check it out, get the whole story. But I shot that hog and had a very sparse blood trail with it because a piece of fat from that hog clogged up the entrance and exit wounds. And it didn't go that far, and I eventually found it. But it was just more difficult than it could have been otherwise. And so we got the idea, well, let's try out these H-Manels. And my goodness, it was night and day difference from those plain old 170 grain soft point bullets. Now, like I mentioned, this cartridge is basically obsolete now. I think it fell by the wayside in about the 1950s. Remington stopped making rifles and ammo for it. And you can still find Model 8 rifles out there in .32 Remington. And you can get custom hand loads from places like Lonnie Crib at Superior Ammunition. I think Hendershots makes them too and stuff. Or you can hand load. So you could certainly hunt with this cartridge if you wanted to. But a .32 Winchester Special gives you essentially the same performance. You can get new production rifles in it, and you can get factory ammo from companies like Winchester. So no need to hunt with this rifle cartridge unless you just think it's interesting and cool and you want to hunt with a Model 8. And if that's you, then by all means do so. Okay, now let's step things up a lot from the .32 Remington to the 8mm Remington Magnum, also known as Remington's Big 8. This cartridge came out in 1977, and it is essentially a full-length 375 H&H Magnum case, neck down to 8mm. And it is important to note this is a true 8mm cartridge. .323 caliber bore diameter, so it's different from the .32 Remington and .32 Winchester special bore diameters I just talked about. 3.6-inch overall length, 65,000 psi. So you need a full Magnum-length action to accommodate this cartridge. But this is a very powerful, very capable cartridge. Even more powerful than the 8x68S that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, but probably predictably, this round really did not go anywhere, despite the efforts of guys like Charles Askins and Craig Boddington, who both really liked this cartridge and did their best to promote it. So why was this the case? Well, on one hand, 8mm bore diameter, just not that popular in the United States. It's still considered a European, specifically a German bore diameter, and people on this side of the Atlantic are much more prone to use something that is either 30 caliber or 338 caliber in that general size and power range. And the 8mm, true, it splits the difference a little bit between them, but it just never really was a thing. Now, the other thing is this cartridge also recoiled a lot. It hit hard on both ends. Now, Nosler currently still makes factory ammo for the 8mm Remington Magnum. They have one load 180 grain ballistic tip at 3,200 feet per second, or a 200 grain AccuBond at 3,000 feet per second. Both of those loads have around 4,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. That's up there with 33 Nosler or 340 Weatherby performance. Now, like I mentioned, Craig Boddington was a big booster of the 8mm Remington Magnum. I'm going to read two different excerpts he wrote about it in different books. The first one is from him in the book Any Shot You Want. The 8mm Remington Magnum shoots flat enough for any sheep hunting, but its power really isn't needed on such game. It is perfectly at home in Africa, where it can be used to take the full range of plains game. In North America, there's really no game the 8mm Remington Magnum can't handle, but I tend to think of it as an elk cartridge. Whether for hunting bugling bulls in timber or shooting across alpine basins, the 8mm Remington Magnum can do the job. It was this cartridge that accounted for my best elk, a beautiful bull that bugled from his bed but wouldn't come in. We crawled in close and I shot him when he finally stood. Later, I took the same 8mm Remington Magnum to the high Arctic on my first musk ox hunt, where it performed equally well. John Wooters and Ken Elliott are among the many well-known riders who have used and admired the 8mm Remington Magnum. With that kind of publicity boost it got, it's quite a mystery why it never took off, but it remains a very fine cartridge. Good enough, in fact, that a friend of mine just talked me into letting him build me one. It's an ideal cartridge for situations where you want a bit more than a big 30, a bit better trajectory than you can get from a 338, but perhaps not as much recoil as you'll get from a 340 Weatherby, which means it would make a fine African plains game rifle, great for moose, wonderful for elk, not bad for a mixed bag of hunting in Western Canada or Alaska. I wouldn't hesitate to tackle even big bears with the cartridge, though I must admit cartridges with more frontal area and heavier bullets are better suited, especially when it comes to big coastal bears. The 8mm would be just fine for a mountain grizzly. All right, so that's the end of that excerpt. I don't disagree with anything that he said, but the ideal use case and niche that he lays out for it is a pretty narrow one. Okay, let's hear from Craig again in the Nosler 9th edition Reloading Guide. Throughout most of my career, it has been an article of faith that, despite its popularity in Europe, any American 6.5mm cartridge was destined to obscurity. The amazing popularity of the 6.5 Creedmoor has, at long last, created unprecedented interest in caliber .264, bringing along a spate of new 6.5mm cartridges across all velocity ranges and plenty of new bullets. Sadly, this miracle has not yet happened to the bullet diameter 8mm, .323 inch. The great old 8x57 Mauser retains a small following, but no 8mm cartridge has achieved lasting popularity in North America. Honestly, I thought the 8mm Remington Magnum would do it. For sure, Remington gave it their best shot. Introduced in 1978, America's top gun riders hunted elk with it at the Remington Riders Seminar on the Mescalero Reservation. An amazing number of big bulls were taken, and for the next couple of years, sporting magazines were festooned with stories on the Big Eight. Despite plenty of publicity and good initial sales, the cartridge never really took off, and almost certainly never will. Unfortunately, shooters quickly discovered that it kicked. It's a mystery why this should be a surprise. Push a 200-grain bullet to around about 3,000 feet per second, and there will be recoil. The question, is the performance worth the pain? That depends on what you're hunting. This level of power and pain is unnecessary for any deer-sized game, but the 8mm Remington Magnum is a fantastic elk cartridge, marvelous for the full run of larger African antelope, and shoots flat enough for the most open country. Other than recoil, which is insignificant if you need the power, the 8mm Rim Mag does have a couple of real issues. Its 3.6-inch overall length requires a full-length action. More significant, because it failed the popularity contest, factory loads were limited and never loaded to full potential. Worse, because 8mm has never been a popular bullet diameter, selection of component bullets is not robust. Now, he goes on to list the different 8mm bullets that are offered from Nosler, and then ends with, "It's beyond my power to breathe new life into this cartridge. Lord knows I've tried, but if you're looking for a real elk thumper, don't overlook the 8mm Remington Magnum." End of quote. Now, he is correct that Nosler does have a good selection of 8mm bullets well suited for this cartridge. The E-tip, the Partition, the AccuBond, to a lesser extent the ballistic tip, but this is a high-velocity cartridge, and you need tough bullets for optimum performance with it, especially if you shoot something at close range unexpectedly. But those will all work. And yeah, a 200-grain Partition at 3,000 feet per second will do a number on an elk. That is a very powerful load. Plus, you also get a little bit more frontal surface area with an 8mm bullet as opposed to a 30 caliber bullet. I'll also point out that we at Northfork offer our semi-Spitzer bonded soft-point bullet in .323 caliber in 180 grain, 200 grain, and 220 grain configurations. Those would all be fantastic choices for use with an 8mm Remington Magnum. They'll also work with some of the less powerful 8mm cartridges as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that Charles Askins was also a fan of the 8mm Remington Magnum. He was also just an 8mm fan in general. Seems like a lot of gun writers just have their shtick, and 8mm was his. Now, we could do an entire episode on Charles Askins, and he was quite the character, to put it mildly. His autobiography is titled Unrepentant Sinner, and that tells you everything you need to know about the man. This book is out of print, but there are some, let's just say, interesting stories in this book, to put it mildly. Some of these stories involve hunting and killing men. Others involve hunting and killing animals. I'll read you an excerpt from this book where he talks about flying in a small plane from Alaska into the territorial waters of the Soviet Union and commences to hunt polar bears on the frozen ice cap. This story took place before Remington introduced the 8mm Remington Magnum, but he uses a Wildcat 8mm 404. 404 Jeffrey neck down to 8mm. Performance was similar, but a little bit more powerful than the 8mm Remington Magnum. Here we go. Our bush pilot set the Piper down between a couple of great pressure ridges. We climbed out and moved forward a quarter of a mile, and this time, rather surprisingly, not atop a pressure ridge, but in a depression between them. Swiss, who is a professional wildlife photographer, set up his cine camera and turned it to running. It was aimed right over our shoulders. The bear was, by this time, boring down on us as though on a radar beam. At 200 yards, he looked gigantic. At 100 yards, I was sure he must be the biggest polar bruin in all the Arctic. Swiss sat by my side as steady and relaxed as though he was back at camp at dinner. At 50 yards, with the white monster coming on rapidly, locked in, it seemed, on our very position, I felt Swiss move very slightly. At 40 yards, it was evident I was going to have to fire because in another half-dozen steps, he would uncover our position. At 37 steps, which we afterward paced off, I shot the great trophy in the throat. He pitched forward on his nose, and this opened up the top of his shoulders, so I poured another round into the spine at the juncture with the shoulders. The bear was dead when he hit the ice. I am never one to make long shots if the game is inclined to come in within close range. The rifle was a splendid Weatherby Mark V, but not chambered for any of the family of Magnum cartridges which the West Coast entrepreneur has so successfully developed. The rifle was chambered for the 8mm 404, a Wildcat of my own design with a 250 grain Barnes bullet. Velocity stands at 2,740 feet. Energy is 4,000 foot-pounds. The fact that I waited until the Bruin was virtually in our whiskers ensured the full power of the cartridge. Now, he goes on to state later that polar bear hunting from the air was banned some 2 years after this foray. And yes, he was hunting on ice within the territorial waters of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But if you've read the rest of this book, you'll know that that was far from the worst thing that he did in his life. But in any case, not surprisingly, 8mm Remington Magnum, very powerful cartridge. You launch a big bullet like that really fast, yes, you can kill the heck out of a lot of stuff with it. I would not at all be surprised to hear that somebody somewhere has killed a Cape Buffalo with this round either. But like I said, this was a cartridge that, as good as it performed and as capable as it could be in the right hands, I don't think it really ever had a shot of being a super popular cartridge due to the disadvantages I laid out earlier. Now, as a somewhat humorous aside, Lane Simpson used the 8mm Remington Magnum case as the parent for what would become the cartridge we now know as the 7mm Shooting Times Westerner. He started wildcatting that cartridge in the late 1980s, and he was talking with the folks at Remington, trying, initially unsuccessfully, to get the company to back that cartridge and get it standardized with SAAMI. And they were hemming and hawing and saying, oh, this cartridge, I don't think it's going to be very popular, yada, yada, yada. But then somebody got the bright idea to look at the brass sales, component brass that they were selling, and they noticed a gigantic spike in 8mm Remington Magnum brass being sold. And he said, yeah, dummies, the 8mm Remington Magnum didn't just get a big spike in popularity. All those people are buying that brass, which you were selling none of 2 years ago, and they're using it now to wildcat the 7 STW. And as the story goes, that was perhaps the decisive factor in getting Remington to get behind the 7 STW and take off with it. All right, now let's talk about the last cartridge we'll discuss in this episode, the .325 Winchester Short Magnum. This was the last member of the Short Magnum family from Winchester. Now, some people thought there would be a .338 Winchester Short Magnum, but I've heard that the engineers at Winchester couldn't get the performance they wanted out of that cartridge with .338 caliber bullets because those bullets were too long, and they were either encroaching into the case and affecting powder capacity, or they were making the overall length of the cartridge too long to fit in rifles in that chambering. So they shifted instead to 8mm or .323 caliber to mitigate those problems. So 8mm wasn't their original plan for it, but that's what they ended up doing. Now, in retrospect, it shouldn't be surprising that this cartridge didn't really pan out. It's like the folks at Winchester had this idea, hey, see this thing that the guys at Remington did that didn't work? Let's do that, but we'll do it with a smaller package and maybe it will work better for us. Not a terrible idea, but I'm also not surprised that this cartridge kind of flopped. Now, like all members of the Winchester Short Magnum family, .325 WSM uses a beltless cartridge with a slightly rebated rim. It's a very short, fat, yet very efficient cartridge. Now, the body of all the Winchester Short Magnum cartridges is fatter than even the belted portion of the .375 H&H. So for that reason, you get a larger diameter container to put powder in, especially if the cartridge has minimal body taper like all the WSMs did. So this is how you get a cartridge like the .325 WSM that nearly matches the giant 8mm Remington Magnum in case capacity, yet it fits in a much shorter package. Max length 2.86 inches long. It fits in a short-action rifle, same as a .308. It's about 3/4 of an inch shorter overall than the 8mm Remington Magnum. It is not quite as fast as the 8mm Rem Mag, but it's close. And it has a little bit less recoil, but it still, has somewhat stout recoil. Winchester and Nosler currently make factory ammo for it. You can get a load with 180 grain E-tip at 3,050 feet per second, 200 grain Accubon at 2,900 feet per second, 220 grain PowerPoint from Winchester at 2,840 feet per second. Winchester currently offers it in their Model 70 and XPR rifle. Now, like all the Winchester Short Magnum cartridges, it had to deal with all of the Rick Jamison patent drama in the early 2000s. That was a giant mess, and it took a cartridge like this that I think was kind of already on shaky ground, being an 8mm, and just making it even more difficult for it to get established. Now, all the Winchester Short Mags are still around. I think the 7 Short Mag is just about dead, though. 300 Short Mag is most popular, 270 is next, then the .325 is number 3. So not a bad round at all. Like I said, 8mm Remington Magnum, one of the disadvantages of it was you needed a full-length Magnum action, and it had a lot of recoil. Well, you can fit this cartridge in a true short action, and it has a little bit less recoil. But you get all the good things that people like about it without a couple of the bad things. So, but it's also in that just weird in-between bore diameter. I don't know that there's really that much that you can do with an 8mm that you can't do with a 30 caliber. And you don't have nearly as many 8mm bullet choices as you do 30 caliber or 338 caliber bullet choices. But that said, though, even though this is a somewhat niche round, it seems like everybody that has one loves it. And it's darn effective on anything you would reasonably hunt with it. And in addition to a lot of the usual suspects like elk and moose, I can also see this being a very effective cartridge on something like nilgai, where it's a big, tough animal that lives in terrain where it's very difficult to track them in. I can also imagine this being quite popular for use on game like sambar deer in Australia, things like that. Email me if you have a .325 Short Magnum, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com. I'd love to hear from you, learn more about what you think of this cartridge, your experiences with it, if my assessment of it matches with your lived experience with it. So of all those cartridges I've talked about in this episode, there's really only 3 that are in somewhat common use. You got the 32 Winchester Special, 8x57mm JS, 325 Winchester Short Magnum. 8mm Remington Magnum, kind of barely hanging on there. The 8x68mm S, somewhat popular in Europe. And then you have those rimmed versions of the 8mm Mauser that are also used a little bit too. But those, I get the impression, are much more niche offerings. Now, at least in my personal opinion, you are welcome to disagree with me on this. In fact, email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, if you disagree with me on this. Despite what Boddington or Askins would have you believe, I don't think 8mm is a magic bore diameter. I don't think it really does that much more for you than a 30 caliber will. Don't get me wrong, it works, I think, essentially just as well as a 30 caliber, but I don't think there's a marked difference in how well it works compared to a 30 caliber of similar power. For reference, a .323 caliber bullet has about 10% more frontal surface area than a 30 caliber bullet. Now, even the results I observed on that hog I shot at the story I shared at the beginning of the episode were much more the result of just some lucky shot placement and bullet selection than anything else. And like I alluded to, I've shot other animals where results weren't nearly as spectacular with an 8mm cartridge. Now, I have one very special announcement to share with you as I wrap up. I am honored to be among those nominated for the Podcast of the Year award at the 2026 Gundies. Thank you to all of you who nominated me for this award. Now I need your votes again to win it. Voting opens on 1 December 2025, so please go to thegundies.com, vote for me, John McAdams of the Big Game Hunting Podcast, to win Podcast of the Year. You can vote for me once each day from 1 until 15 December when voting ends. As the saying goes, vote early, vote often. The Gundies Award ceremony is 19 January 2026 at the Venetian in Las Vegas, the night before the SHOT Show begins. Thanks a lot for your vote in advance. I will put a link in the episode description to where you can cast that vote. Remember, voting opens on 1 December, so that's a couple days in the future, but this was my last regularly scheduled episode before then, so I wanted to let you know. Now, if you enjoyed this all-encompassing 8mm/32 caliber roll-up episode, make sure you listen to all of the other episodes I've done on different bore diameters. So far, I've also done 25 caliber, 6.5 millimeter, 270 caliber, 7 millimeter, 30 caliber, 33 caliber, 35 caliber, 9.3 millimeter /375 caliber, the 40 caliber Safari cartridges, and the really big bore 50, 60, 70 caliber cartridges. Links to all of those episodes are in the episode description. Don't worry, I'm going to finish up with the last few, like the other 40 caliber cartridges, very soon. Same thing with 22 caliber, same thing with 6 millimeter. That'll do it for this episode. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.